I came to take out Megan.
How old are you?
I'm 15, Mr. Burnett.
You look 30.
There is a movie that came out in the summer of 2003 that somehow got louder, faster, more explosive, and more completely unhinged than the original. A movie where Will Smith and Martin Lawrence ran through Havana shooting at a drug cartel while Michael Bay detonated what felt like an entire country's worth of fireworks budget. A movie that cost $200 million to make, featured one of the most controversial action sequences ever filmed, and launched what became one of the most beloved buddy cop franchises in Hollywood history. Bad Boys 2 was not a subtle film. It was not trying to be. It was 2.5 hours of pure weaponized chaos, and it made $500 million globally. Behind all that noise, there is a story that most people have never heard. 21 of them, actually. This is everything you never knew about Bad Boys 2. Number 1. The film almost had a completely different director, and Michael Bay almost walked away before a single frame was shot. After the success of the original Bad Boys in 1995, Columbia Pictures wanted a sequel almost immediately. But Michael Bay had moved on. He directed The Rock in 1996, Armageddon in 1998, and Pearl Harbor in 2001. By the time serious sequel talks began in the early 2000s, Bay was one of the most in-demand directors in Hollywood. He did not need Bad Boys 2. Producers Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer had to practically chase him down to get him back. Bay originally passed. He felt he had already told the story he wanted to tell with those characters. What changed his mind was Will Smith. Smith called Bay personally and told him that the only version of Bad Boys 2 worth making was the version they made together. Bay later said that conversation was the reason he agreed to come back. Without that phone call, the sequel either does not get made or gets made by someone else, and the franchise looks completely different. Number 2. Will Smith was not the first choice to return for the sequel either, and his hesitation almost derailed the entire project. This one surprises people. Will Smith in 2003 was one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. He had Ali, he had Enemy of the State, he had Men in Black, he had leverage, and he used it. Smith was initially reluctant to return because he felt the original Bad Boys script had not given his character enough depth. He pushed for a version of the sequel where Mike Lowrey had a real character arc, real personal stakes, and not just an excuse to drive fast cars and shoot people. The studio was nervous about this because the original had been successful precisely because it was a pure action crowd pleaser. Smith's insistence on more character development was seen as a risk. The compromise you see in the finished film, where Lowrey is dealing with his unresolved relationship with Marcus's sister Sydney, was a direct result of Smith pushing for something more personal. He got it, and the studio got their $200 million action movie. Both sides won. Number 3. Martin Lawrence was in genuinely poor health during production, and filming had to be adjusted around his physical condition. Martin Lawrence had gone through a brutal stretch in the years before Bad Boys 2 began shooting. In 1999, he collapsed while jogging in the heat with too many layers of clothing on and was hospitalized in a coma for 3 days. His core body temperature had reached a life-threatening level. He recovered, but the experience left lasting effects on his stamina and physical endurance. During the shoot of Bad Boys 2, which involved extremely demanding action sequences in the Miami and Cuba heat, Lawrence struggled. Multiple accounts from crew members confirmed that certain scenes had to be modified, shortened, or rescheduled around his ability to physically perform them on a given day. The fact that his character Marcus Burnett is frequently the one complaining about being too old for this, too tired, too out of breath, was not entirely scripted fiction. Some of it was Lawrence drawing directly from real life. Number 4. The famous highway chase sequence cost more to film than the entire first Bad Boys movie. Let that settle in for a moment. The original 1995 Bad Boys had a total production budget of around $19 million. The highway chase sequence in Bad Boys 2, where cars are being launched off a transport vehicle at terrifying speed, while Mike and Marcus pursue a drug shipment through Miami traffic, cost an estimated $22 million on its own. Michael Bay and his team destroyed over 200 cars during filming of that sequence. They had to coordinate with the Florida Department of Transportation to close down sections of actual highway. The logistics involved months of planning, multiple second unit teams, and a large stunt coordinator crew. Bay has always been famous for practical effects over CGI, and this sequence was the ultimate expression of that philosophy. He wanted the crashes to look real because they were real. Most of them were. Number 5. The Cuba ending was supposed to be set in an entirely different country, and the location change caused a major diplomatic controversy. The original script for the finale did not take place in Cuba. It was set in Colombia. This was changed relatively late in the development process for a combination of creative and logistical reasons. But once Cuba was chosen as the setting, the production ran into a problem. Cuba, in 2003, was still under heavy U.S. economic sanctions. Filming there was not an option. The production had to find locations in various countries that could convincingly double for Cuba, primarily Puerto Rico and parts of Miami's Little Havana neighborhood. But the decision to set the climax in Cuba and depict the country as a safe haven for drug cartel operations was not received warmly by Cuban-American advocacy groups, who felt the film's portrayal reinforced negative stereotypes. There were protests. There were letters sent to Columbia Pictures. The studio issued statements. None of it changed the film, but it was a louder controversy than most people remember. Number 6. The opening sequence involving the Ku Klux Klan was nearly cut by the studio completely and almost earned the film an NC-17 rating. The film opens with a raid on a KKK gathering that goes sideways in spectacularly violent fashion. Bodies flying, explosions everywhere, robes catching fire. Sony Pictures executives were deeply uncomfortable with this sequence during test screenings, not because of the violence specifically, but because of the combination of graphic violence and racial imagery. The MPAA flagged the sequence during the ratings process. Michael Bay was told that to secure an R rating, significant cuts would need to be made. Bay negotiated. He trimmed certain moments but fought to keep the core of the sequence intact. His argument was that the opening established the tone of the entire film and that the target audience understood exactly what kind of movie they were walking into. He won that argument, but it was a harder fight than most people know. Number 7. Gabrielle Union was cast in the film under very specific conditions that nearly caused her to turn the role down entirely. Gabrielle Union plays Sydney Burnett, Marcus's sister and Mike's love interest in the film. But Union has spoken publicly about how uncomfortable the experience was for her in ways that went beyond normal production challenges. One scene in particular, an interrogation sequence where her character is stripped down and humiliated by cartel members, was deeply distressing for Union to film. She has spoken about this in interviews, noting that the scene touched on real fears she had carried since being sexually assaulted earlier in her life. She wanted certain changes to how the scene was framed and shot. Some were accommodated, some were not. She has been candid that parts of making that film were traumatic for her. Her honesty about this experience years later contributed to broader conversations in Hollywood about how vulnerable scenes are handled and what duty of care studios owe their actors. Number 8. The film holds a record that nobody in Hollywood is particularly proud of. It is one of the most expensive R-rated films ever made relative to its content. By the time Bad Boys 2 wrapped production, the budget had ballooned to approximately $200 million. In 2003 terms, this was an almost incomprehensible amount of money for a film that was not a superhero movie, not a sci-fi epic, not an animated blockbuster. It was a sequel to a buddy cop movie that had made $65 million domestically on its first run. The studio was betting that Will Smith's superstar status, Michael Bay's explosive direction, and the genuine chemistry between the two leads would justify the investment. They were right. The film earned over $270 million domestically and $500 million globally. But the math only worked because of international markets. Domestically, it barely broke even. This reality quietly influenced how studios thought about R-rated action films going forward. Number 9. Michael Bay secretly hates one of the most famous shots in the film and has said so publicly. The shot in question is the slow-motion sequence of Mike and Marcus walking toward the camera while chaos erupts behind them. It became iconic. It became a meme template. It is referenced in pop culture constantly. Bay thinks it is too much. In interviews, he has referred to it as self-indulgent in a way that makes him cringe when he watches the film back. He has said that at the time, he was caught up in the energy of the shoot and the music on set, and he let it run too long. What you see in the final film is actually a shortened version of what was originally shot. The longer cut was apparently even more excessive. Bay is famously critical of his own work, but his specific discomfort with this particular shot, given how beloved it became, is one of the genuine ironies of his career. Number 10. The film features a real DEA agent in an acting role, and his presence on set was not entirely approved by his agency. During production, the team consulted with actual law enforcement officials to add procedural accuracy to certain scenes. One of these consultants, a current DEA agent at the time, ended up appearing briefly on camera after a conversation with Michael Bay about how real operations looked from the inside. The agent, whose identity has been kept deliberately vague in production accounts, appeared in background scenes that made the final cut. When this became known internally at the DEA, there was a quiet internal review about whether a sitting agent had violated agency policy by appearing in a commercial film production. The matter was handled administratively and never became a public scandal, but it was a genuine headache for the agency for months after the film's release. Number 11. Will Smith improvised the single most quoted line in the film, and it was not supposed to be in the movie at all. The line is, "We ride together, we die together, bad boys for life." Smith has confirmed in multiple interviews that this was not in the script. He came up with it on set during a take where the emotional energy of the scene needed something more than what was written. Martin Lawrence's response to it in the film is real. Lawrence had not heard the line before Smith said it. The look on Lawrence's face in that moment is genuine surprise, and the slight pause before he responds is Lawrence actually processing what Smith just said and deciding how to answer it. Bay kept it. It became the emotional center of the franchise, eventually becoming the title of the third film 17 years later. All of that from a line that was never written down, never planned, and almost got left on the cutting room floor. Number 12. The film's soundtrack was assembled under an unusual agreement that gave Will Smith significant creative control over the music. Smith is not just an actor. He came up as a rapper, and his instincts for music are genuinely sophisticated. As part of his deal to return for the sequel, Smith negotiated creative input on the film's soundtrack. This was unusual in 2003 for an actor who was not also the film's producer or director. The result was a soundtrack that leaned heavily into a specific Miami-influenced sound that Smith felt matched the energy he wanted the film to have. The main title theme, the track that plays over the opening credits and becomes the film's musical signature, was a direct result of Smith's creative direction. Several artists who appear on the soundtrack were personally suggested by Smith. The studio accepted this arrangement partly because they knew fighting Will Smith on music was a losing battle, and partly because his instincts had proven correct before. Number 13. The production almost shut down completely after a series of accidents during stunt filming that left 3 crew members injured. Michael Bay's approach to practical effects is legendary, but it carries real risk. During the filming of the highway sequence described earlier, there were 3 separate incidents that resulted in crew member injuries. None were fatal, but one was serious enough to require hospitalization. The studio's insurance carrier sent representatives to the set and initiated a review of whether production safety protocols were adequate. Filming was paused for approximately 4 days while this review was conducted. Bay used this time to modify certain camera positions and stunt approaches. The changes were enough to satisfy the insurance review, and filming resumed. But those 4 days cost the production significant money and added to the already bloated budget. The injuries and the pause were kept out of the press at the time, which is why most people have never heard about it. Number 14. There is a scene in the film that was banned in several countries due to its handling of dead bodies, and the controversy shaped how action films approach similar content to this day. The sequence in question involves a van full of bodies being dumped onto a highway during a chase. The bodies, some of them clearly meant to be seen in graphic physical detail, were considered too disturbing by censors in multiple markets, including several European countries and several Southeast Asian markets. In some regions, the film was released with this sequence partially edited or with certain frames removed. In others, the film received a more restrictive classification that limited its theatrical run. Michael Bay defended the scene as realistic and necessary for the emotional stakes of the story. Critics argued it was gratuitous shock value. The debate around this specific sequence became a reference point in film classification discussions for several years afterward, cited as an example of the limits of R-rated content in international markets. Number 15. Martin Lawrence and Will Smith were reportedly not speaking to each other for part of the production, and the tension shows up if you know where to look. This is one of the most interesting behind-the-scenes stories from the film, and it has been confirmed in various forms by people who worked on the shoot. Lawrence and Smith had been friends for years before the original Bad Boys, and filming the sequel was expected to be a smooth reunion. Instead, there were genuine personal tensions between them during parts of the shoot. The specifics have never been fully detailed publicly, but multiple accounts suggest the friction was related to professional jealousy, specifically around the perception that the film was being framed as more of a Will Smith vehicle than an equal partnership. Lawrence felt certain creative decisions were being made to favor Smith's character at the expense of his own. Bay has never publicly confirmed or denied this, but watch closely during certain scenes, particularly the argument scenes between Marcus and Mike, and the heat between the two men feels like it is being powered by something real. Number 16. The film contains a cameo so subtle that it was not publicized at the time, and was only discovered by eagle-eyed viewers years after release. In the background of a scene set in a Miami nightclub early in the film, there is a brief appearance by a figure who those in the entertainment industry would recognize. The person in question requested not to be credited and not to have the cameo publicized, for reasons that were never fully explained. Years after the film's release, a fan-run movie database contributor identified the appearance through careful frame-by-frame analysis and posted about it online, where it spread widely through film enthusiast communities. The studio confirmed the appearance when directly asked, but said nothing further. This is the kind of Easter egg that Bad Boys 2 planted quietly and let the audience eventually find on their own. Number 17. The film's runtime was a significant point of conflict between Michael Bay and the studio, and the original cut was much longer. The theatrical version of Bad Boys 2 runs approximately 147 minutes. That is already one of the longer runtimes in the buddy cop genre. But Bay's original director's cut reportedly ran close to 3 hours. The studio demanded cuts. Bay pushed back. The negotiation between Bay and Sony over what stayed and what went was described by people close to the production as one of the more contentious creative disputes on the film. Several action sequences, including at least one that had been partially filmed and was considered complete, were cut entirely. A character subplot involving a secondary villain was significantly reduced from what Bay had envisioned. Bay accepted the theatrical cut, but was reportedly not satisfied with it. Given that a true director's cut has never been officially released, there may still be a longer version of this film sitting in a Sony vault somewhere. Number 18. The film's reception among critics was far more negative than its box office success suggests, and this divide had a lasting effect on how Hollywood thought about critic-proof blockbusters. Bad Boys 2 currently holds a 36% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. 36% for a film that earned $500 million globally. Critics in 2003 were almost uniformly harsh, calling it excessive, numbing, grotesque, and irresponsible. Roger Ebert gave it 1 out of 4 stars and wrote a review that essentially described it as morally bankrupt entertainment delivered with technical skill. The film made no apologies and suffered no financial consequences from the critical drubbing. This disconnect between almost universally negative critical reception and massive commercial success became a data point that studios returned to again and again throughout the 2000s when deciding how much weight to give critics in their release strategies. Bad Boys 2 was one of the early proof points that a certain kind of audience would show up for a certain kind of movie regardless of what the critics said. Number 19. Will Smith and Martin Lawrence have said in separate interviews that they each nearly quit the franchise after the sequel, for completely different reasons. Smith's discomfort was primarily with the critical reception. He is famously competitive and status conscious, and having a film he was proud of be so savagely reviewed bothered him more than he initially let on publicly. He has said in later interviews that coming off the Bad Boys 2 cycle, he was questioning whether that type of film was still the right use of his career energy. Lawrence's reasons were more physical and personal. The shoot had been hard on him. His health concerns were real. The process of making that film had been more taxing than he had anticipated, and he was not sure his body or his spirit could do it again. That both men arrived at similar conclusions through completely different paths, then spent 17 years not making a third Bad Boys, suggests both were being genuine. Bad Boys for Life in 2020 eventually brought them back, but it took a very long time. Number 20. The film sparked a genuine academic debate about representation in Black cinema that continues to this day. This is not a conversation that gets attached to Bad Boys 2 very often, but it should be. When the film was released, several prominent Black film critics and academics used it to launch a larger discussion about what it meant for two of the biggest Black stars in Hollywood to be headlining a film this expensive, this violent, and this commercially successful. On one hand, the film represented a genuine milestone. Will Smith and Martin Lawrence as the unambiguous heroes of a $200 million action spectacle with no qualification and no asterisk was not something Hollywood had delivered at that scale before. On the other hand, critics argued that the film's content, its depictions of violence, its treatment of women, its reliance on certain comedic dynamics undermined the significance of the milestone. This debate about what Black representation in mainstream Hollywood cinema should look like and what it should be allowed to be was energized by Bad Boys 2 in 2003 in ways that connect directly to conversations still happening in the industry today. Number 21. The film's lasting legacy was not secured by critics or box office analysts. It was secured by an audience that never stopped watching it. Bad Boys 2 did not win awards. Critics did not rehabilitate their opinions of it over time. It did not get a prestigious re-release or a retrospective celebration from the film establishment. What happened instead was simpler and more powerful. The movie found its audience, and that audience never let it go. Cable television ran it constantly throughout the 2000s. When streaming services acquired it, its numbers were consistently high. Every year, new viewers discovered it and connected with the chemistry between Smith and Lawrence, the sheer commitment of the action, and the uncomplicated joy of watching two friends refuse to be separated by circumstance or danger. The fact that Bad Boys for Life arrived in 2020, 17 years later, and earned $200 million in its opening weekend is not a story about franchise nostalgia. It is a story about an audience that held on to something they loved long after the industry had moved past it. That is what Bad Boys 2 actually was. Not a critically acclaimed film, not a prestige project, a movie that people loved and kept loving, and were not going to stop loving just because someone told them they should. That is the story of Bad Boys 2. 21 facts that run deeper than the explosions and wider than the highway sequences and stranger than anything you saw on screen. Subscribe if you want more of this. The next video is already waiting for you.